And we'll start. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody, for coming. We don't have next month's program scheduled yet, but it'll be up online real soon. Where's Kath go? Hey, Kath, do you want to give a quick plug for other upcoming programs? So, as always, our great food is done by Kath Thomas.
What I want to talk about, there are two events. One is a class you can take that's up to date marine electronics, and that is on the 15th. And there's a 10% discount for members of the museum. The poster for that's in the back. It has one of those QR codes, and you can scan it, or it's in our newsletter, or see me and I'll give you the rest of the information on that. I think it's $49. And the one that the 15th of April. Yeah. Is this a test?
I don't remember saying it. I know that's terrible.
And on April 22nd, we are going to have the Chicago premiere. Bill Soffren has written a book about sailing the tall ship, HMS Rose, through a hurricane to be used in the Eastern Commander film, where Patrick O'Brien books melded into that movie. And so the book comes out on April 18th. We'll have the book, and we'll here to do 2 programs on that Saturday. We're hoping people will bring kids between 2 and 4, and then we'll do it again between 7 and 9. It's got some great film and great stories, and it's free to everybody. The museum will be charging, but the lecture and Will's book signing is, we hope you'll come. Thank you.
Sounds good.
All right. As always, we greatly appreciate everyone who's members. If you're not, we'd love for you to join. If not, hopefully sometime in your future will earn you wanting to join. Also, we've got a lot of volunteer opportunities. If anybody's interested in learning more about them, please see me after the program. So tonight, this is a program I've been really excited about having for a long time. And exactly 20 years ago tonight, on
201 years ago.
20 years ago.
Oh, okay.
I'm going there first.
Well, you're going there first, okay.
Yeah, 20 years ago, Terry Gregory started the Chicagoology website. It's an incredible resource. If you haven't seen it, please check it out and spend a lot of time playing with it. There's a lot of really great information there. So it's a really nice coincidence that this is the 20th anniversary of the start of that. Terry has been retired since he was quite young, as he still is, and lived in Hawaii for a while. And we're glad that he moved back to Chicago because he loves the weather here and loves the city.
It's true.
He's just a remarkable researcher, and fortunate for us, he's the great grandson of the very famous Shipbuilder, which we're learning all about tonight. So let's thank Terry Gregory for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you for spending your St. Patrick's Day night with a bunch of old Irish sailors. John Gregory was born on March 17th, 201 years ago, in the border town of Crossmaglen, County Armagh in Northern Ireland. Crossmaglen is also the town that comedian Martin Short's family is from. The Gregory family still resides there, and so does the Short family. John and his 2 brothers left Ireland in 1844, just before the Great Potato Famine. After being nationalized in New York City in 1849, his brothers James and Francis were enticed by free farmland offered by the Illinois Central Railroad in exchange for helping to build the railroad in Amboy, Illinois. John opted to settle in the Great Lakes region, arriving first in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and started his trade as a ship's carpenter. He arrived in Chicago in 1858 and resided in the River North area until the Great Fire broke him out. Our family plot is in Calvary Cemetery in Evanston, and we don't move much. On the right is a daguerreotype of his wife Catherine's son from about 1865. The Inner Ocean reported on August 6, 1880, that John Gregory died at Milwaukee on Wednesday morning. It wasn't our Chicago John Gregory, however. That's all the close we got of information on him. Captain Gregory passed away on March 2nd, 1894, just a few days after his wife, who died on February 24th. This obituary was the only mention of his passing in the newspapers. Here are some of the shipyards that were around before the 1871 fire. Some are the result of changing partnerships, and others were merely small docks. In January 1868, the Empire Dry Dock Company was formed by William Bates, A.J. Latham, C.J. Marshall, James Matthews, Stephen Bates, William Graham, and John Gregory. They were soliciting for subscribers to buy stock, which apparently never happened. South River Dock was
divorce is a human tragedy. Like that.
somebody's talking. In Buffalo, New York, Jacob W. Banta and his partner, Brigadier General Bidwell, some of the largest somebody going on? Built some of the largest side wheelers on the Great Lakes during the 1850s. General Bidwell supervised the carpentry and finishing work on several of these steamers on the lake. General Bidwell was killed in March 22nd, 1866 in the Civil War, and Jacob Banta moved to Chicago. There he started a small shipyard on the west side on the Chicago River near Harrison Street. William Wallace Bates bought the shipyard along with John Gregory, who was the ship carpenter. Today, Bates is considered the most influential shipbuilder working on the Great Lakes during the age of sail. In 1870, John Gregory designed and supervised the construction of a new dry dock in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. After the fire, John Gregory worked in Wisconsin while Chicago was rebuilding. In December 1874, William Bates, along with Andrew and Thomas Miller and Orville Olcott, organized a new company, Chicago Dry Dock Company. It was located at Wells Street near Harrison, which was on the east side of the river, just literally across from the other one. Irish squatters settled along the north bank of the Chicago River at Wolf's Point, which they named Kilgubbin. However, in 1865, the city burned down their shanties and they moved to Goose Island. At the time was inaccessible by bridge. The first bridge over the Chicago River at Halsted Street was opened in 1866. Miller's Dry Docks opened in 1867, was located on the corner of Halsted Street and North Branch. A Division Street bridge was completed in 1869. In 1880, Mr. Orville Olcott constructed a large new dry dock situated to the east of Miller's Docks, and these Goose Island dry docks often called upon the services of John Gregory. This chart shows the number of ships that were dry docked in Chicago from 1859 to 1885 during the winter, and that considered Chicago as their home harbor. There was about 400 boats on the docks and along the river during the winter. This chart represents the timeline of each of John Gregory's boats. On average, they had a life of 37 years, the longest being 85 years and the shortest 8. As of now, the count is 29 boats, 6 sail and 23 steam. Chicago's original skyline was a forest of masts that lined the Chicago River. Schooners were cheap to build, and because they could be operated by as few as 5 people, they were cheap to operate. An owner could recover his investment as little as 2 years. By 1870, more than 1,700 wind-powered vessels were registered on the Great Lakes, almost 3 times the number of steamships. John Gregory designed and built 6 schooners, which originally all operated in Lake Michigan waters. The Mary A. Gregory is built by John Gregory at Doolittle and Olcott's Yard on Goose Island and was launched at 4 p.m. on May 18, 1875. This ship was named after his 27-year-old niece, Mary A. Gregory of Amboy, Illinois. The original owner and captain was Nathan Saunders, who passed out cigars at a launch expecting the huge profits he was going to bring in. Vessels were given a classification rating that determined a vessel's insurance premium. Ratings of A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, or not insurable were assigned. A1 being the highest rating with the lowest premium, a rating usually reserved for new vessels. Always well cared for, insurance inspectors rated Mary A. Gregory A2 as late as 1895. Mr. Saunders sold her in 1891. For some time, she loaded barreled fish from northern Wisconsin waters to Milwaukee and Chicago. At the turn of the century, her ownership shifted to Michigan ports, usually owned by her master, and was well known from the Straits of Mackinac to St. Joseph. In 1924, the Mary A. Gregory was docked at Douglas, Michigan, just south of Saugatuck. John Boatman then accepted a request to carry a small load of potatoes and local fruit to Chicago. The Mary A. Gregory became the last commercial sail vessel to enter the port of Chicago, an unbelievable contrast to the maiden voyage of the schooner in 1875, when 21,000 sailing vessels arrived in the port at that port in a single season. After discharging her cargo at South Water Street, she was towed up the north branch of the Chicago River and moored in the mud alongside A. Burrell's yacht yard, where Captain Woltman was the foreman. The boat was deteriorating fast, and in 1926, it was decided to tow her out to Lake Michigan and give her a Viking funeral. Just before the ship was to be sunk, Captain Woltman secured the 7-foot carved eagle, figurehead, lanterns, caulking chisels, and megaphone from her for sentimental reasons. Not long after the captain passed away in 1927, the family donated these items to the Chicago History Society. They have been on permanent display there since 1935. The two-masted schooner Libby Now was built June 5th, 1867 in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The ship was owned by Peter Peterson, who was in partnership with Lambert Now and Lars Olson, and was used for the next 5 years in their lumber and grain trade. In some records, Peterson was credited along with Gregory as the builder of record. Peterson has been a shipbuilder, promoter, master craftsman, expert sailor, and captain in 1873, Mr. Peterson also credited with building the Anna M. Peterson, which was not only one of the largest schooners on the lakes, but one of the fastest as well. However, the Libby Now did win the first unofficial race to Mackinac Island in 1881 against 3 other fully loaded schooners. The Libby Now was converted from 2 masts to 3 masts in Chicago in 1892. This photo was taken in 1910 in Boyne City, Michigan. In 1912, the Now was purchased by Ole Haverson of Milwaukee for $400. She was underwater for some time and quite waterlogged when she was pulled out and pumped dry. She was converted to a lumber barge and towed into Sturgeon Bay by the steamer City of New Baltimore. In 1918, she was abandoned. John Gregory of Chicago built a 2-masted schooner for David Dull in 1867 named Margaret, or Maggie, Dull. Her captain was William Dull. She was launched out of Michigan City, Indiana, rebuilt in 1892 as a 3-masted schooner. The Maggie was involved in 2 Christmas ship runs during the turn of the century. The first was during the 1896 season, when on November 10th, she washed ashore near Glencoe, Illinois, with a load of Christmas trees. Her master was Charles Nelson, who later became a part owner of the Rouse Simmons and died on her ill-fated 1912 Christmas tree run when he was on board as a guest. The Maggie's second run was made in 1904 under the master of E.F. Ellefson. The Maggie was never rated lower than B1 for most of her life, another testimony of the quality of John Gregory built hulls. The Dahl family owned the Maggie until 1899. The Maggie was heavily involved in the potato trade during the turn of the century, and it was one of her potato runs that a strong gale left her beach on South Manitou Island in Michigan on November 16th, 1906. The 5-person crew were able to walk ashore in the sand, but she was broken up by the heavy seas in just a few weeks. The schooner, Horace Tabor, was close to the Maggie during the storm, but escaped. There were a lot of shipwrecks in South Manitou Island, and they were like the Congress, the Walter R. Frost, the H.D. Moore, Three Brothers, P.J. Ralph, and the Francisco Morazan. South Manitou Island is now part of the beach of the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. In 1870, Sheboygan was in the process of building a new dry dock. It was being supervised by B.B. Jones. Unfortunately, he died in September 1870, and the project was taken over by Thayer and Gregory, with John Gregory succeeding Jones. The Higgy and Jones was launched in August 1872 from this shipyard. The original owner was William Higgy, and it is possible that Higgy added the name Jones as a tribute to B.B. Jones, not been confirmed. She had 3 masts, and at 173 feet, she was one of the largest schooners to sail the Great Lakes, weighing over 400 tons. The Higgy and Jones was renamed Higgy on March 9th, 1882. Leaving Chicago on the evening of October 27th, 1882, the Higgy made the most rapid round trip to Buffalo on a record in 11 days and 18 hours, including 8 hours at anchor and the Straits and 36 hours unloading and loading coal in Buffalo. In 1884, Edward E. Eyre purchased the Higgy, and he was a prominent South Water Street cedar merchant. On November 7th, 1885, the Higgy left Chicago for Collingwood, which is number 1, with a cargo of grain. Shortly after leaving Collingwood, a fierce snowstorm was encountered. Supposedly, the captain lost his bearings as the Higgy brought up on a rock near Tobermory Harbor, number 2, which is at the entrance of the Georgian Bay from Lake Huron. After striking a rock, the vessel began to leak badly, and with some quick alterations, the crew succeeded in heaving the vessel off the rock. She was then headed for Owen Sound, but when got even with Cabot Head at number 3, she was making water so freely that it was found necessary to run around the beach in order to save the lives of the crew. She was accordingly headed towards shore and allowed to set on a sandy bottom. The next afternoon, 2 tugs came along who were hired by Captain Layden to tow the Higgy to Owen Sound, number 4. The vessel was leased and a second start made for the port, but it was soon found it would be impossible to keep her afloat, and she was run into Lionhead Harbor. The boat was saved and finally released on November 10th. The owner, Edward E. Eyre, put $13,000 in repairs and then changed the name to George Sturgis in 1890. On September 25th, the George Sturgis picked up a load of 2.75 million lats at Camp Belton, New Brunswick, to take to New York. The weather was fine until October 2nd when a hurricane struck and the vessel was being torn apart near the Magdalen Islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The lats were dumped, but the boat was no longer in control. The captain and 7 crew members were forced to cling on to the remains of the hull. On the morning of October 3rd, a steamship approached and saved the entire crew. The captain, who lived in Nova Scotia, was dropped off as the crew went to Boston via rail. Don't have much on the Cecilia, but it was built in White Lake, Michigan as a 3-masted bark. John Gregory assembled her in Chicago in September 1868. She was first owned by James Larson and Company, and he was also their captain, the ship's captain. In 1879, she was rebuilt as a schooner. The Cecilia has a history of getting wrecked during her short 7-year life in Great Lakes waters. Once in 1872 near Manitou Islands, another in 1873 near Ontario, and twice at Jacksonport, Wisconsin, 1883 and 1885. The wreck on September 11th, 1885 was her death blow. The Cecilia was taken on cordwood at the Jacksonport Pier when the first storm came. She was then hauled out into the lake and anchored safely. Later, the northeast wind was so severe that she dragged her anchors until she was thrown upon a reef and was quickly pounded to pieces. The crew was safe, but over 150 cords of wood were lost. Captain Smith, the owner of the Cecilia, tried to save her, but couldn't get a wrecking crew to do the job for less than she was worth. So there she lay until she was discovered along the remains of the schooner Perry Hannah in 2002, which sank in 1880. The schooner Bertha Barnes was launched on August 9th, 1872, from Theron Gregory's shipyard in Sheboygan. She was owned by Ludington and Company, and Captain J. Sargison was her first master. The Barnes had 3 masts, a crew of 6, and was outfitted with steam boilers to hoist the sails. She weighed almost 300 tons. On the night of July 12, 1904, the crew of the Bertha Barnes, along with the Seamen's Union, secured as United States Marshal to tie the Bertha Barnes up. As they demanded the captain to pay their wages. The crew claimed that they were due pay for 24 days, while the captain asserted the wages due only for 22 days. The captain was forced to pay his men. In 1909, Captain Herman Schoonerman leased the Bertha Barnes for his 23rd Christmas tree run trip to Upper Michigan. His family ran the Christmas tree routes from 1887 to 1918. On this particular run, only 15,000 trees were brought back. Bad weather and ice-encrusted trees, which were half bare. Plus, they were hard to chop down. The following season, Herman Schoonerman bought 1/8 interest in the ship Ralph Simmons. The popular captain and his crew perished in a storm on the Simmons during the 1912 run. Part owner of the Simmons was Charles Nelson, was a guest on this run. The Bertha Barnes, as the W.D. Hossack, arrived in port along with the George Marsh on December 8, 1912. Both were encrusted in ice, but were able to survive the storm, which took down the Simmons. When this wooden ship was acquired by Schlossler in 1911, he named it for Australian Captain Hossack because of the friendship they had developed on several transatlantic voyages together. The steam engines which operate the sails can be seen in this photo of the tug Sport touring her. On August 4th, 1920, she floundered on the Isle of Pines just south of Cuba. There were 9 aboard at the time, but no lives were lost. About 200 shipwrecks have been reported among these islands. And by now, you're probably wondering, who was Bertha Barnes? On March 26, 1868, Miss Mary Ludington, daughter of wealthy lumber merchant Nathan Ludington, married New York publisher Charles J. Barnes. The 1872 schooner was named after their daughter Bertha, who was born a year later on June 5th, 1896. On June 5th, 1896, she married James Clinch Smith, who was a descendant of the founder of Smithtown, Long Island, New York. The wedding was a very prestigious reception, which included Harry Selfridge, Marshall Field, George Pullman, and several members of the McCormick family. The couple were separated for a while due to his wife's obsession with music, but she agreed to give it up and to live in Smithtown. At the time, they were both in Europe, and John Clinch Smith said he would go to New York first and look for a new home, while Bertha would stay in Paris for a few months. Smith bought a first-class ticket on the Titanic. Oops. On August 20th, 1912, Mrs. James Clinch Smith died because she died in Switzerland because she never recovered from the shock of her husband's death. She was only 44 years old. The tugs were the workhorses of the harbors. Although most of the Chicago harbors were designed for towing in and out of the breakwater areas along the river, a few ventured out as far as 15 to 20 miles looking for tows. The bigger tugs were used to tow barges and scows around the lake. By city ordinance, schooners were not allowed in the river without a tug tow. Competition was fierce at times. Races to get a line first to a helpless schooner in need of a tow could be vicious. Tugs also had unofficial races between one another. The winner of such races created a lot of braggadocio. Tugs used to charge whatever they wanted, kind of like what Uber does today. That change effective November 1st, 1874, when the city of Chicago devised a rate plan along with discounts for fast payment. The city council also made it unlawful for bridges to be swung open during the morning and evening rush hours. This meant tug captains were always challenging the bridge tenders during these swingings. This caused some heated arguments between the tenders and the captains, and some accidents. In 1878, John Brigalet and Captain Dennis of Green Bay commissioned John Gregory to build a tug to be used in Green Bay waters. The owners were so happy with the results, they named it the John Gregory as a compliment to their designer and builder. The tug was launched in June 1878, and public excursions to Sturgeon Bay began on the 4th of July. By the end of the first season, the John Gregory had already achieved the reputation of being the best tug in the lake, and went out into any sea when other tugs dare not even venture outside the river. The Gregory is often used to break ice in Sturgeon Bay. The Gregory was involved in many race challenges. One, for example, took place on June 17, 1882, between her and another tug, the O.B. Green. The distance was 5 miles, and the Gregory won by 1.5 lengths. They were both Gregory tugs, so it was a win-win. In August 1883, George O. Spears sold the John Gregory for $6,000 to Manitowoc shipbuilders Random Berger, today known as the custom yacht builder Berger Boats. They used Gregory to bring in profitable repair vessels. The John Gregory capsized during a storm on the night of November 13, 1904, at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River, about 1/4 of a mile northwest of the Cleveland station. Winds reached as high as 60 miles an hour. The master, Captain Del Minnie, drowned. She had a crew of 6, and of the 3 on board, 2 were rescued by the life-saving crew after a hard battle with the waves. The O.B. Green was the first tug built for Oliver Bourne Green. Green was operating a dry dock, which meant he would need tugs to bring in broken ships for repair. He commissioned John Gregory to build a tug, and in May 1865, the 41-ton OB Green was launched. On November 8th, 1879, a new whistle was installed on the Green, and was found to be so loud and disturbing that it immediately became a nuisance on the Chicago River. With General Grant visiting Chicago in a few days, the captain of the OB Green was ordered to replace the whistle, or his tug would not be allowed to participate in the planned 53 tug whistle salute. That would have been something. He complied. In November 1878, there was a trespassing skirmish between the crews of two tugs at a nearby saloon. After Chicago Harbor constable was whacked hard with a coupling pin, there was an immediate order to arrest the captain of the Green on a charge of murder, which the early papers reported. It turns out the constable was just knocked out. The weekend of March 19th, the Green was ordered to clear the ice around the crib at Chicago Avenue. However, it got imprisoned in the solid ice and was pushed south as far as 59th Street in Hyde Park. Another tug, the Mosher, was sent out to provide provisions to the crew, but she was unable to reach the Green as well. Finally, after 36 hours of effort, the ice broke up behind the tug and the Green was able to reach the crib. In September the same year, Captain Edward Napier resigned the command of the tug Green in order to superintend the completion of Oliver Green's new tug, which was on the stocks of the Miller Brothers North Branch Yard on Goose Island. Green decided to name his new tug the OB Green. However, since he no longer owned the first OB Green, he had to get its current owner to change the name to the Commodore. The Commodore was afterwards referred to by the old tugman as the Old One. In 1946, the Commodore ended up in a ship boneyard in Thessalon, Ontario, Lake Huron, shown here alongside with another Gregory boat, the GR Gray. In September 1881, the new OB Green was launched at Oliver Green's yard along the main branch of the Chicago River. As stated earlier, she was built on the Miller Brothers Goose Island shipyard. The Green hit the Harrison Street Bridge stringers in 1886, knocking off the roof and stream valves. Some of the bridge walk shot up 50 feet in the air. Fortunately, no one was injured. In September 2nd, 1900, an interview with the Chicago Tribune, Captain Lewis Grow and his wife claimed the OB Green was haunted. Friendly but mischievous spirits were guiding him to find the ruins of the steamship Chicago, which sank 5 years ago, or which sank 5 years earlier. The ghosts were obviously gaslighting him. The Chicago was finally found on May 21st, 2001, about 15 miles offshore using side scan sonar equipment. The Bismarck was built in the new shipyard of Thayer and Gregory in Sheboygan and was launched on July 5th, 1871. The tug was so large that Sheboygan declared the day on an official holiday on her launch. The tug's 147th length was likely the largest tug on the lakes, with an engine of 172 horsepower. She was designed for towing barges from the mills of her owners, Messrs. Tyson and Robinson in Manistee, Wisconsin. In 1872, the Ludington Lumber Company, Bertha Barnes Ludington, purchased the boat, and Captain John C. Parrott became her master. Just as the Green was 2 years earlier, the Bismarck became a target of the Citizens Committee in 1881 for having a rather loud and obnoxious whistle. When Captain Parrott was notified by the Citizens Committee of Chicago that he must no longer use this particular whistle, he replied that due to the size of the tug and the fact that she'll be towing several monster barges behind her, often on the lake at night during the fog, he would still use his whistle as he thought necessary. So he didn't comply. Captain H.G. Blanchard bought the Bismarck in 1884, and she was employed in the Saginaw, Michigan lumber trade. She was renamed Justice Field a few months later. I think he was a judge, he really was. In 1881, immediately after an overhaul, the Justice Field was bought by the Saginaw Bay Towing Association and was renamed the Traveler. In 1892, the ship was rated at A1.5 with a value of $28,000. The Traveler was overhauled again in 1902 after it was sold to a Canadian lumber company. Ship is getting bigger. In 1920, the Traveler went through another complete overhaul. This included new modern engines and boilers plus wireless equipment. It was then purchased by the Spanish River Pulp and Paper Company. She was renamed the G.R. Gray after the manager of the wood department of the Spanish River Company. It was used in towing pulp wood to the company's mills. On August 22nd, 1926, the Gray, with a raft of over 7,000 cords of pulp wood, was the largest raft that has been towed down Lake Salt. The tug was still in operation in 1936, working for a paper mill. The tug's last reported outing was in December 1941, when she rescued a stranded crew on Beecher Island in Lake Superior. These are photos of the Gray and the Commodore at Dessalines, Ontario Boneyard between 1945 and 1950. The tug, Frank S. Butler, was launched in the spring of 1865. She was named after the owner, Frank S. Butler, and Butler, who was the master of the A.B. Ward when it blew up on August 20th, 1881, and nearly killed him. The tug was badly crushed by the 256-ton steam barge Swallow against the piers of Rush Street Bridge in 1883. She was abandoned in Oswego, New York in 1922. John Gregory built the tug A.B. Ward at the Miller Shipyards in Goose Island on April 30th, 1866. Co-owners were Justine Bowman and John A. Crawford, both of Chicago. Her original master was Frank S. Butler. Beginning in 1868, Congress required all vessels to be registered with a government-assigned number. These numbers were to be painted using white oil paint on the main beam under the forward side of the main hatch. And ships with wood beams must be carved in, with each number being at least 3 inches in height. At the time, the 1866 A.B. Ward was assigned number 381. However, likely by a transcription error, the number was changed to 388 in the April 29th, 1872 enrollment. Number 388 was in use until 1893, when the number returned to 381. There was another A.B. Ward tug built prior to 1859, was in service to 1865. A.B. Ward was a composer during the Civil War and composed marches. No confirmation if this is the same A.B. Ward that the new A.B. Ward is named after. A few minutes before 6 a.m. on August 20th, 1881, the tugboat A.B. Ward was towing the barge George M. Adams to the lake and blew up on the Clark Street Bridge, the result being the loss of 3 lives and the destruction of $20,000 worth of property. Captain Frank Butler, who was in charge of the Ward, was blown into eternity and fell on the deck of the barge. The remains of the Ward were sent to Miller's Dry Dock, where she was rebuilt. Captain Butler was also successfully rebuilt, but at another facility. The determined cause of the explosion was low water in the boiler. Here's the Ward and the rescue of a car plunged in the river from an open Rush Street Bridge. I guess it happened back then. In 1911, the machinery was taken out of the Ward and the hull converted to a houseboat without any motive power. The tug William L. Ewing was built during April of 1868 in Chicago by John Gregory. Her original owners were Chicagoan C.T. Taylor and Charles Pierce. The boat was possibly named after William Lee Ewing, who was the 5th governor of Illinois and a U.S. senator. At the beginning, the tug was used to take public excursions to the 2-mile crib east of Chicago Avenue. Looked like good times. Contrary to modern belief, smoke was a huge problem for Chicago, even back in 1892. Coal burning furnaces and tug engines smothered the city with a heavy soot. In 1892, the tug Ewing was fitted with 13 steam jets of the Western Smoke Preventer Company's device for the first trial in the experiments by the Society for the Prevention of Smoke. This tug was turned over to the Society by Captain Dunham, who completed the work in about 2 weeks. The boiler in the Ewing was about the average for a Chicago tug boiler. The furnace was only 31 inches high and the boiler was patched in many places. Even though it was an old affair, it was representative of its class. On the last year of the century, the tug was surrendered in Chicago as abandoned and not fit for service. Originally, the General Shields, or Michael Shields, name was changed to M. Shields in 1873. She was involved in a hit and run incident in June 1886. The schooner Eva Fuller was just rounding the crib when 2 tugs were racing to grab her tow line. The Shields was the first to arrive and the line attached, and the other tug came crashing into the schooner and damaged her significantly. The captain of the mystery tug backed up and sped away. The harbor buzzed about the captain who damaged the abandoned and disabled the vessel, but the tug was never identified. In 1902, the tug's shields were showered with bricks and coal at the Kinzie Street Bridge upon when Union sympathizers did not see any Union card on her. And that was because the captain left the boat to pick it up. The 3 men on the deck were not given a chance to explain. The shields was burned on May 30th, 1904 in Lake Superior near Portage Lake, Michigan. Okay. The vessel owner's towing company's protection was launched on May 31st, 1873. In 1878, the protection overtook the monitor of the Union Towing Association to a boat that the monitor was entitled to. Of course, the VOT people denied the soft impeachment. In 1879, the protection handily beat the Garner by a half mile, but again, both captains denied they were racing. On October 31st, in 1883, the little schooner Arab, filled with lumber, was on a third of her way to Milwaukee when a storm blew her back across the lake to St. Joseph. The crew was safe, and after pumping the schooner out, the Chicago tug Protection was sent over to pull her out and get her to Milwaukee. Unfortunately, the 50-mile-per-hour winds pushed the Protection and the Arab back toward Michigan, and were both considered lost, as there was no sightings. It was feared that all 11 sailors were drowned. The map shows approximation of the journeys with the red arrows indicating the wind-blown routes. Finally, a telegraph was received on November 13th that the Protection was anchored near the town of Saugatuck, Michigan. The Arab sank, and its saving crew was sent to the rescue them, but had to wait until the seas calmed down. All crew members were safe except Captain Kelly of the Arab. The Protection was finally pulled out in June the following year and was back in commission on July 8th, 1884. On April 23rd, 1889, the Protection took part in what was a revolutionary experiment, the testing of Marconi's wireless telegraph apparatus on rough waters. From the lookout on top of the United States Life-Saving Station at the mouth of the Chicago River, telegraphic messages were sent through space to the Marconi receiving apparatus on the tug Protection, which was chartered and put at the disposal of the electrical experts by the Chicago Tribune. Not only were the Morse dots and dashes sent and received satisfactory up to a distance of 2 miles, but the telegraphing was carried on while the tug was plunging through a rough sea at a speed of 15 miles an hour. Beyond that distance, the apparatus refused to work, probably in the opinion of the electricians, because the zinc sphere which received the electric waves was fastened to a pole only 26 feet high. It wasn't until 1901 when Marconi succeeded in signaling across the Atlantic from the west coast of England to Newfoundland. On Thursday, Protection was busy. On Thursday, February 23rd, 1893, the George T. Burroughs was trapped in ice 18 miles outside of Michigan City, Indiana. 2 sailors from the steam volunteered to take a perilous 18-mile ice walk to shore to get help. They set out Friday morning at 7 a.m. and they arrived late Friday night. 2 tugs were sent out Saturday, but returned unable to ascertain where the Burroughs was located. On Sunday morning, the tugs Protection and the Tom Brown, both Gregory tugs, were sent out to free the ship from their Franklin Street dock in Chicago. They arrived at the Burroughs by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a trip that should normally take 3 hours. All 3 boats arrived in Chicago at 4:30 Monday morning, so it took a long time to get the break free of that ice. This is a much abbreviated narrative of the story. It is almost unthinkable today of anyone walking on wilderness ice for 18 miles. It was common for old tugs to be rebuilt using old parts from another tug. The 17-ton tug C.W. Evans, originally built in Buffalo, New York in 1864, was rebuilt into the Frank R. Crane. The rebuilding was performed by John Gregory at Goose Island during 1878. She was owned by the Chicago Dredge and Dock Company, of which Frank R. Crane was the secretary, and cost $7,500. Anything happened until 1916, when it was gone, so nothing much there. The steam John Leatham had been rebuilt from her 1852 predecessor, the Tift, by Schofield and Company at Sturgeon Bay during the winter and spring, and was launched on the morning of the 4th of July, 1878. She was christened after John Leatham, one of the employees of Schofield. She was built from designs and specifications furnished by Captain John Gregory of Chicago, one of the best shipbuilders of the lakes, and under whose immediate supervision she was constructed. On July 21st, 1920, she was sold to Tugboat Holliswood Incorporated in New York. Charles F. Hathaway took this photograph from the Grand Haven, Michigan South Pier on October 8, 1903, after the Lethem had lost its rudder in heavy seas. It wasn't until sometime later that tug Dombos was able to get up steam to get a line to Lethem and bring it through the piers as shown. Many postcards were made of this. On July 6, 1921, it was renamed the Holliswood. And on October 12, 1925, the Bergen Point, New Jersey lighthouse keeper saw Captain Sims' tugboat Holliswood towing 2 barges go aground. After he saw the men clinging to the sinking tug, he pushed off in his tiny little boat at the risk of his own life and brought the captain and crew of 4 to safety. 2 weeks later, Holliswood was declared officially lost. The tug Charles W. Parker was launched on June 29, 1873 out of Doolittle and Olcott shipyard near Van Buren. She was named after Charles W. Parker, proprietor of the Columbia Iron Works and son of Captain Thomas J. Parker, then of Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. The one thing about the Parker is she never seemed to be in one piece. On September 22nd, 1879, the boiler of the Charles W. Parker exploded a half-mile outside Lincoln Park, and the explosion was described as being of a sudden and terrific character. The boiler and the boat were literally blown to atoms, and of the 5 men who manned the tug, all perished except one, who was thrown into the air 50 feet and fell into the water. He was picked up by the EP ferry, which fortunately happened to be nearby. The tug Parker was rebuilt and was running May 30th, 1880, and it was claimed that she was a better boat than the day she was first launched. Jacob Johnson paid $400 for the wreck and now had a boat worth at least $7,500. On November 22nd, 1883, shortly before 6 o'clock in the morning, the schooner Granger, laden with lumber, and charged by the tug Parker, collided with the Rush Street Bridge while the ladder was swung open and so damaged to the center that the 2 ends sank upon the projections of the center pier entirely, wrecking the structure and the gear in the center. It was just a weird accident that 2 tugs happened to come at the same time. At 4:30 in the afternoon, October 4th, 1891, the boiler of the tug Parker exploded with terrific force just north of the bridge, which crossed the river on Archer Avenue between Paulina and Ashland Avenue, killing instantly 7 people and injuring 10 more, some of them fatally. The Admiral, which blew up New Year's night in 1886 in the South Branch, about a mile from the scene of the previous days of this recent disaster, was the last Chicago tug destroyed by explosion previous to the Parker. A very careful investigation was made into the cause leading up to the accident and found that the captain and engineer of the boat were considered very careful and reliable and experienced men, having had years of experience on this line of work. And they both knew full well the dangers of the locality in which they were engaged. The water in this portion of the river was of a very dangerous character owing to the proximity of the slaughter and the gas houses in the river. The opinion was rendered that the accident was caused by the use of this polluted water for making steam. The effect was to cause the boiler to foam badly, thereby making it almost impossible for the engineer to keep the water in the boiler at the proper height. The sudden stopping and starting of the engine, if the water in the boiler was low, was deemed sufficient to cause the accident. The boiler is well built and well taken care of, and under ordinary conditions would have lasted a lifetime. This tug named the Edward B.P. Ferry was launched on May 11, 1873 at the Van Buren Street Shipyard at Doolittle and Olcott for the vessel owners towing company. As you can see, they look very similar to the Parker. When the tug Parker, another of John Gregory's boats, blew up on September 22nd, the ferry saw an object land nearby. The object was the lone survivor of the accident, Henry McGuire, the deckhand. Mr. Ferry was a prominent citizen of Grand Haven, Michigan, and was one of the owners of the lumber house of Ferry and Brothers of Chicago, and he largely invested in vessel property. He was also one of the leading stockholders of a towing company. The ferry burned down in the harbor of Duluth during January 1900 at total loss. The tug Alert was built for Oliver B. Green, was out on the river on July 22nd, 1874 for her trial trip. The craft was of small size, being only 40 feet long, but was pretty well modeled and strongly put together. Captain Napier was her first master. The Alert was involved in a few reported races. On November 28th, 1878, she raced the original O.B. Green and lost. On April 22nd, 1880, she raced the SS Cove, but no winner was given. And on August 16th, 1902, she did win a race against the Fred Drews. Third time's the charm. On March 26, 1888, with the Alert in the rear and the tug Al in the front, the Wells Street swing bridge was guided to its new location at Dearborn Street in a 3-hour trip along the Chicago River. 3,000 freezing persons watched the spectacular sight. The one Chicago Tribune editor had fun with this. There is no bridge at Wells Street, yet there is a Wells Street bridge. There is no Dearborn Street bridge, though there is a bridge at Dearborn Street. She was abandoned in 1915. Shortly after the Sturgeon Lumber Company purchased a mill in 1879, its president commissioned John Gregory to build a tug for their lumber hauling business. Their new tug was launched by its captain and builder, John Gregory himself, on March 30th, 1880. It was considered one of the finest lake tugs in Sturgeon Bay and was used for hauling brick and lumber in the bay. Unfortunately, the tug had a very short life. On October 30th, 1888, the Lawrence and the tug Merrill was allegedly racing just a few miles outside Milwaukee. Her boiler blew up, killing 4 crewmen. The tug's remains were discovered in 1999. The Merrill was probably the last boat built by John Gregory. She was inspected and measured in June 1883. The Merrill had a 140 horsepower Fraser and Chalmers engine installed, along with a 125-pound boiler that was built by National Boiler Works. The owners of this craft, Singer, Talcott and Company, owned an asphalt mine in Cuba. The intention was to use the Merrill along with towing scows to bring asphalt from the mine. The tug left for Cuba in the fall of 1883. When she arrived there, however, it was learned that an American tug could not work in Spanish waters, and as a consequence, she was sent back to Chicago. The requirement was that a tug had to be built in Cuba and be registered under the Spanish flag. Such a wild goose chase as the Merrill made had never been recorded in the whole history of navigation and common sense. It was considered a pleasure excursion, and the Merrill was temporarily labeled as the American Goose. The tug arrived in the Joliet docks in April 1804. However, in August 1884, the government seized the Merrill. The seizure brought about the refusal of the tug's owners to pay a $500 fine, which was assessed against her July 1st by Collector Spaulding for carrying passengers on the lake. Other tugs were assessed at the same time, but even though the fine was reduced to $20, the Merrill owners refused to pay even that amount. Despite the fact that Merrill was registered in 1883 to carry passengers, the local inspector refused to renew this permission because of the new law. On the morning of October 9th, 1885, a party of 20 men, guests of Singer and Talcott, started from the foot of Franklin Street on the tug Mirror to take a trip up the river, through the canal to Lamont, and then to Lockport. Most of the party were from Joliet and Lockport. After a short run out into the lake, the boat started her trip way up the river. The trip as far as to the stockyard branch was uneventful. When that point was reached, the friends of the passengers were assembled on the banks to watch the boat commence her perilous voyage to the south. At first, handkerchiefs were waved in the air and fond farewells were exchanged. Soon, for obvious reasons, the handkerchiefs were put to less romantic but better use. As the boat passed the place where the pumping machinery stirs up the water so that the full force of the aroma could be appreciated. It was the original intention to go to the stockyards, but by unanimous consent, the plan was given up. The water itself presented the most disgusting sight that could be imagined. The sewers were continually pouring their contents into the stream, and there was absolutely no current. The refuse matter floated on top. There was a black, greasy scum upon the surface, dotted with here and there with dead dogs, cats, old shoes, rotten apples, etc. The tug finally cut her way through the slime and reached the pumping works on Ashland Avenue, where the party landed and inspected the surroundings. The reporter left them, and they pursued the even tenor of their way down the canal to Lamont, intending to return by train. In 1912, the Mariel was sold to SB Shipment and was registered in Canada. She was last listed in the 1940 Canada list of ships. The Menominee River was built in Green Bay, Wisconsin by John Gregory. She was owned by Captain Thal. Her trial trip was made April 10th, 1879. The tug was strongly built and of superior model, similar and built to earlier Gregory tugs. She was used for many years on the Menominee River near Green Bay as a fire tug. In 1950, Menominee River again became the property of Captain Thrall, and he set about at once to rebuild her. She was made larger and somewhat wider, and as before, the captain sold the boat almost immediately after the restoration. Her name was changed in 1920 to Archie Scott after she was bought by a Canadian company. Horsepower increased from 100 to 200. During the summer of 1923, the Scott was used to help the dredging of the Black River in Port Huron, Ontario. On July 16th, while pulling a scow under the 10th Street Bridge, the tug's smokestack didn't quite make it. And so the top of his cabin and the whistle pipe were torn off, allowing all the steam to escape and leaving the tug helpless. She was abandoned in 1937. Side wheelers, also known as paddle steamers, were very common along the Mississippi River. Boats with paddle wheels on the side are termed side wheelers, while those with a single wheel on the stern were known as stern wheelers. The plans and models of the side wheeler MC Hawley made up by John Gregory. She carried passengers and freight between Green Bay and Manistee, Michigan. In 1880, the steamer was accused of having an annoying whistle, just like the OB Green had. Thomas Hawley sold the steamer to McCormick and Company of Green Bay on October 12, 1882 for $13,000. And in 1884, her name was changed to City of Green Bay. Thomas Hawley repurchased her for $10,500 in 1885. In 1889, she was converted from a side wheeler to a propeller. The conversion was done in Manitowoc and was ready for launch on August 11, 1889. It was christened as the Dauntless, but that name was never registered. On August 19, 1909, the steamer burned at Whistler's Point in Saginaw Bay, Michigan, with eight persons on board. No lives were lost. The large lake tug Joseph C. Parrott, which was built in the Brandenburger shipyard at Manitowoc in 1881 by John Gregory for the Marinette Barge Line Company, received her machinery and completion at 22nd Street. She was 160 feet long. She was provided with two compound engines of respectively 27 and 44 inches in diameter and 40 inches stroke, built by the Detroit Dry Dock Company. She had a marine tubular boiler of 11 feet in diameter and 17 feet in length. Her cost was upwards of $40,000. The tug J.C. Parrott took the place of the Bismarck, on which John C. Parrott was the Bismarck's captain. The Parrott arrived in Green Bay on April 17, 1882. She was one of the best tugs on the lake and belonged to the Marinette Barge Line. The hull was built in Manitowoc and fitted up in Chicago. In 1883, the same time the Mary was fighting excursion fees, the Parrott crew spotted a man in Lake Michigan, obviously seeking help, but they refused to, under penalty of law, to expense for the privilege of burning coal and going out of their way to save a life. It wasn't their job. On August 29, 1895, the tug Parrott was chartered to tow a Wisconsin and Michigan railroad car ferry between Peshtigo and Chicago. The tug pulled car ferry number 1, which was loaded with 26 railroad cars, filled mostly with coal and general merchandise. Railroad car ferries have been successfully operated across Lake Michigan, but this was its first run for bringing them into Chicago in direct competition with the railroads between Chicago and Green Bay. She was renamed the J.C. Ames in 1896, and then George Now bought the Ames in 1908. He paid $50,000. On July 16, 1970, she took the largest raft of logs for pulpwood ever to go through the Sioux Locks, 1,000 cord for Green Bay. She was dismantled in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, and her final room was surrendered in Milwaukee in 1923. In 1882, somehow the name of John Gregory as a marine architect reached the ears of the heads of the Hudson Bay Company, and at their request, he prepared a model for a steamer to operate in Lake Winnipeg. Designed by the noted Chicago shipbuilder John Gregory, modeled after the latest type of Missouri River steamboat, the Marquis was the largest 200-foot steamboat to travel the Canadian prairies. Her hull was made of white oak, while her upper works were of white pine. She was equipped with the most up-to-date machinery and furnished with carpets, piano, mirrors, and silverware. In fact, she had everything except the drought adapted to the river she was built to navigate. Built in Winnipeg in 1882 for the Winnipeg and Western Transportation Company, she cost over $50,000. The Marquis was named after the new Governor General, the Marquis of Lorne, who visited the area with his consort at that time. In 1890, she was hauled to Prince Albert in hopes she could be used on the upper reach of the river, but was beached permanently there. For some years, she was used as a dance hall while she slowly disintegrated on the shore. A local resident then used the wood to construct his house. Parts of the hull were still visible in 1923 on a riverbank, but these were finally destroyed by a number of fires. Some of the fretwork of the Marquis was salvaged for the pilot house of the Saskatchewan. Mr. Gregory also was requested to build models of other vessels for Winnipeg, but it was not absolutely certain the names of these vessels, assuming they were built. The Marquis is the only vessel confirmed to use his plans. Possible other ships that used Gregory's models were the Princess in 1881, the Red River in 1882, and the Saskatchewan in 1883. And that's the end. I need a beer. Any questions, anything? I don't know what to do. What do I do now? Ask for questions?
Terry,
Yeah.
when somebody asks a question, please repeat it for the Zoom audience, since our Jabra is no longer working. Repeat any
Okay.
questions.
Okay. Yes.
With all the name changes, didn't they know about the old law, never change the name of a ship?
Yeah.
What was that again? About the name changes?
Law of the sea says you never change the name of a ship, it's bad luck. And
Well,
they,
The ships change names all the time.
He was saying it's bad luck.
What's that?
It's
it's
bad luck.
considered bad luck to change the name of a ship.
It's a
The question was, if it
superstition.
wasn't considered bad luck to change the names of ships. Some of these ships had like 3 and 4 names, so it was more of a bad luck to name it after a living person. That was more taboo than anything. But I mean, there's tons and tons of ships, and you see all the names, they were changed. The numbers were difficult. To change a number was difficult. Any other? Yes.
So in the way he was designing ships, did he just lay this out when he's putting out the keel and just kind of as a carpenter scope it out? Did he have plans that he drew himself, or were there pattern books? he used?
The question is, what did he present or design with? Based on all the records I found, he used models. He built little models, laid it all out. I think he gave the measurements, all that kind of stuff. He was a carpenter by trade, so he built the models pretty well. And he laid out the specifications and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think he supervised the buildings, but he didn't really, was there with the hammer and the board and cut the saw and that kind of stuff. He didn't do that. Any other questions?
I have a question with those ships that blew up, the engines.
Yes.
Did they, as we would say in certain trades, lessons learned from one incident, it wasn't that passed to others, I mean, was there a common thread with some of them?
The question is about when boats blew up, didn't they learn something from that?
Yeah. and
Well,
share.
yeah, I mean, a lot of the instances that the tubs blew up is because the water level was too low. And it could be a reason because of one instance where they were traveling through mud and they couldn't keep the water level up. Another one was an assistant engineer wasn't paying attention. Another one was they were pushing it too hard. I mean, these were sort of like instances that just happened. Because a lot of these guys knew how to run the ships. They knew how, they had the pilot, they had the engineers, they had the guys that shovel the coal in. They had all these guys that are doing their job. So they all knew what their job was, but sometimes things just happen. Any other?
How long is this shipyard in Chicago when did it stop operating?
What's that?
How long, when did the shipyard where they were building stuff on Goose Island and this, when did that stop operating?
I'm sorry, my hearing's not that good, I'm sorry.
When did the shipyard where they were building this stuff in Chicago on Goose Island, when did it stop operating?
Oh, God, they probably stopped, I would say probably after the turn of the century, because that's when they were starting to go build iron steel ships. These are all these are all wood ships, so they were easy to build. But once they went to steel, probably the Calumet, and they got bigger and bigger. So, because all these, even though some of these tugs were going on until 1923, they were still wooden. So even though they kept on getting rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt again, you know, that's probably the question. And then plus, the boats got too big to go through the river. So, you know, so that was, then it became mostly pleasure ships, you know, the yachts use the river and the lake and all that stuff. So I guess that answers your question, does it? Anything else?
Were they made of oak? Other
Um,
lumber materials?
They didn't really specify that, but a lot of them, on one boat on the Bismarck, they said it was made of oak and the upper parts were pine, you know, the cabins and that stuff, but the hulls were oak. And they used caulking chalks and all that stuff to make it watertight. So that was always part of maintenance. So keep it watertight. But they didn't have, I think they heavily varnished them or shellacked them, but that was it. Anything else?
So has everyone, like when you were growing up, this is your great-great-grandfather, right?
Great-great-grandfather, yes.
So between him and your generation, was everyone in shipbuilding?
No. In fact, for the longest time, when I started doing my family history, my dad kept on saying, oh, you gotta look up, well, it was he thought it was he thought it was his grandfather, but it was actually his great-grandfather. You gotta look up about John Gregory. He built a boat that's on display at the History Museum at the Historical Society. And I said, oh, okay, what's the name of the boat? He says, I don't know. He said he used to go there when he was a kid. I go, okay. So I kept on going to the History Museum and they're researching, asking them. There was a boat that was on display, built by John Gregory. Do you know anything about it? What's the name of the boat? I don't know. Well, third base. It kept on going on like that for years until finally I ran into Schooner Passage by Ted Kaczynski, what his name is.
Karamansky.
Yeah, what he said. And that book actually described the Bertha Barnes and the Mary A. Gregory, which was the tug that they took parts off, and that was it. So that was my only lead I had. And once I told him it was the Mary A. Gregory, oh yeah, we know about that.
How many boats did you have?
I mean, they haven't have a flag on there saying built by John Gregory. It's like, yeah, but anyway. So
Terry, we have a couple of, Terry,
Yes.
we have a question from the Zoom audience.
What's that?
From David Klein. Did any of the ships sink or were sunken
Oh, that's fine.
intentionally within the UASC area?
Say that again, please.
Did any of the ships sink or were sunk intentionally within the UASC area?
Sunk intentionally?
That's the question.
You want to know if any of them are wrecked in the Chicago area?
Yeah, if any of them are.
Were shipwrecks in the Chicago area. So some like the Mary Gregory.
Oh, yeah, there were a lot. Oh, yeah, a lot of them were. There was a few of them that did, but a lot of them were just not really. Every one of them, a lot of them were sold for scrap. A lot of them were just literally not worthy. So,
Some of those were scuttled to get rid of them.
some were scuttled, some
They
were
stripped
beached.
them and scuttled.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking mostly about the tugs. And the tugs were, a lot of them, they were rebuilt. They took the hull. One of them was made into a houseboat. They took out the engine and said, okay, move it over down the river and make it into a houseboat. So they were scavenged, people took whatever they could. The engines were probably rebuilt, but at the time, by 1900 and that stuff, nobody was interested. We don't care about them anymore. We want to, we want a diesel engine now, that kind of stuff. So, but back in 1860, 1870, they could rebuild these. They can make them better, faster, stronger for $6 million. But,
That was in the nineties.
yeah, I was just paraphrasing there. Yeah, but nothing, most of the ships are lost, like you saw, a lot of them were lost in Lake Huron, Lake Superior, all over the place, Cuba. But I mean, I think the people that go diving for these wrecks, they find a wreck first and then they do the history. I think that's how they do it, isn't it?
Both ways. Sometimes look.
If they know there's a boat somewhere around here,
Right.
yeah. But again, I mean, like I said, there was one boat, the Shipbuilder, that they were trying to locate for a long time. And this one guy thought these ghosts was gonna help him. He didn't. They were pulling him, they was pulling his chain. Oh, yeah, it's over here. But did you try over here? Anything else?
You know approximately what the horsepower equivalent of any of these tugs were? I know there's a lot of different size boats. These 70 to 100-foot boats, do you know what?
They were, well, depending on the size of the boat, some of my games were like a couple hundred horsepower. But the tugs were like, I think about 70, maybe 50 to 70. I mean, a lot of them were just made to just tow a schooner into a port. That was it. So they wouldn't need to be that big and that powerful. One question was how much horsepower did these boats have? It's like they varied. I don't know.
So I have another
Yeah.
question from this one from Donald Smith. Have you ever come across drawings or pictures of the machinery of the tugs?
Of the interiors of the boats?
Machinery.
Machinery.
On a machine, I only came across one which showed the, I think it was on the, the one that got, what's her name? God, my mind gets, there was one that they said they actually specified the name of the engine that they had. And I was able to find a catalog from that, said, okay, that's probably it, but not really. I'd love to find more information on that, but a lot of the stuff is not that easy to find. You gotta find the catalogs, you gotta find the specifications. A lot of these were custom jobs, built by a local guy that just said, hey, I'll build your own engine. Okay, here it is. So these were not like mass produced. Everything was hand built. Except the bigger ones, except of course the bigger ones where they had the, those were built by big companies. So that's all I know about that. Yes,
Are you still active in building ships?
what's that? I can't,
Are you still active in building ships?
Are you still active in building ships?
am I still active in building ships? Am I still active in building ships? No, I never was active in building ships, but I'm interested in it. I almost bought a boat in Maryland. That was about as close I got. But the boat kept on getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I said, okay, that's it. Let's move to Hawaii.
I know you've done a lot of research for this program, but are you working on other new stuff for Chicagoology or anything?
I'm working on about 40 different topics at one time. I mean, it's just, once you find one subject and also you find another article next to it saying, oh, wow, that's cool. Okay, and then it goes, it's just constantly. Right now I'm doing, because of this presentation, I found out a whole bunch of information on Chicago's fire tugs. I don't know how much you know about them, the fireboats. So I got a whole history down of them, which is fascinating. Chicago was the only city that didn't have a fireboat. Everybody else did. New York had them, Boston had them, Philadelphia had them, Sheboygan had them. I mean, Chicago did not. And the lumber people were yelling for them, saying, we need a fireboat. Give us a fireboat. So I'm working on that project now. There weren't that many. I think there was only like,
So I have a
One.
comment here from Robert Jake to everyone.
yes,
He says smaller steam engine tugboats had around 50 to 80 horsepower. With the engines being steam, the torque was very high. The torque of
Okay.
steam engines was much higher than gas engine of the same horsepower.
that's a
Not a
technical.
question, just a
question.
comment.
Okay, then that's good to know. I would think that the torque is high on those. Because they had a lot of pulling power. I know that. That's all I know. I'm not. All I know is that the big ones pulled railroad cars. So, a lot of them.
Is this Chicago tugboat, the fire tugboat you see on Lake Michigan, that's an active, that's an operational boat, that's, Chicago has a tugboat, fireboat fleet now, is that true? They still have one?
What's the question?
Does Chicago currently have fireboats?
Oh, yeah, they still have fireboats, yes. They
Those
put,
are
they
operational.
do display, you see them sometimes spouting out.
I
But,
know, but are they anything besides decoration? They don't just shoot, they're actually,
They are functioning, yes.
they're probably more life-saving, if anything. Almost like the Coast Guard or something. I think that's what they're used for more now. But again, that's more in the modern era, which I don't get into. I get into like from before 1920. But I will, but that part of the research will be included because it's part of it. I haven't gotten that far yet. I'm still in 1900. What else? Anything else?
Anything else?
Oof.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. And from those of us on Zoom, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Okay, can I have my Guinness now?
Yep. And thanks everyone online. There were 31 people online. so we
Well,
had-
thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed it. It was a chore. But anyway, I hope I did okay.
There was
You
a
did
ton
fine.
of information. Really appreciate all your
Oh,
research.
thank you. It was fun.
You were both.
Have you talked to the guys